Well, hello guys, and welcome back to another episode of A Double-Edged Sword. In this episode, we'll be taking a look at Splatoon 2 on the Nintendo Switch. The original Splatoon only launched 2 years ago as a new IP on the Wii U. I really enjoyed the original game. It was a fresh new take on the online multiplayer shooter genre. The sequel is clearly trying to be much the same, changing some things up while keeping what worked. For some people, they don't change enough, and because of that, they think this game is too similar. I disagree, however, because I think that's too much of an oversimplification that doesn't look at the grander picture. But we'll get to that. Disclaimer. None of the footage used in this video is my own. It's taken from Vinesauce, link in the description and at the end of the video. The Splatoon franchise is classified as a shooter, and Splatoon 2 is obviously no different. Of course, it does vary from your standard Call of Duty or Battlefield. Instead of focusing on killing your enemy, you focus on covering the ground and as much ink as possible. This is what makes Splatoon so different from other shooters. If you're not good at killing the enemy, not a problem. You can still ink turf and help your team to victory. This is half the reason I think Splatoon is as big as it is because even if you're bad at it, in theory you're still doing something right. The standard gameplay of the original Splatoon has been kept intact, while making changes here and there to make it more accessible. The standard weapon classes are all still there, shooters, rollers, chargers, etc. But on top of that, new classes have been adding like the dualies and the umbrella. There are both returning and new sub-weapons like burst bombs, poison mist, curling stones, etc, etc. However, one of the big changes from the original Splatoon to Splatoon 2 is the specials. All the specials but one have been revamped and work completely differently in Splatoon 2. The ink armor is now a less effective bubble, the Stingray is a less effective ink Zuka, and the Tenta missiles are a less effective ink strike. You may have noticed a pattern there, and that's kind of the point. Splatoon 2 puts more focus on skill, unlike the first game, which puts more focus on the specials. I think this is a change for the better, because it allows players to better develop their own skills, instead of having to rely on an occasional bonus. Some people will say that even though these are changes, they haven't changed enough things to truly justify a sequel. My response to that, however, is, what did you expect? There's not much you can change about this game that doesn't change what the game stands for. If you want more weapons, subs, and specials and all that jazz, I understand, but it appears as if they'll be adding new weapons and whatnot in the near future, for at least a year after launch, so that's always a good thing. And even though not everything has changed from the original Splatoon, what has changed is welcome. And overall, the gameplay still works great, so I'm giving it a great. The standard game mode in Splatoon 2 is Turf War. Whichever team inks the most turf wins. The mode is practically unchanged from the first game, and as an introductory mode, it works. Ranked battles are where it gets interesting. There are 3 different types that alternate every 2 hours, and they definitely change things up from Turf Wars. Splat Zones has you taking control of a specific area for a certain amount of time. It's basically Splatoon's version of Domination. Out of the 3 ranked modes, it's the one I feel changed the least from the original game. Maybe the timer goes down a little bit faster, but other than that, it functions the exact same. It's not a bad mode, and variety is always welcomed, but it's definitely my least favorite of the 3 ranked modes. Next up, we have Tower Control, which has players hopping on a tower in the middle of the map to move it along a set path into the enemy's base. It's Splatoon's version of like Payload, but where both teams are fighting to get it into the enemy's base. This mode has changed from the original by adding these points where the tower stops and players must wait a certain amount of time to continue onwards. Other than that, it's basically similar. Then there's Rainmaker, which has players grabbing the Rainmaker, fighting into enemy territory, and placing it on a pedestal. The closest comparison to this in other shooters would be a combination of like Capture the Flag and Uplink. The big change in this mode is that in the original Splatoon, Rainmaker was a bazooka, but in this game, it's a grenade launcher, which I think works a lot better. I actually really like this change, and It's what makes the Rainmaker my favorite of these 3 ranked modes. Now, you could argue that these modes aren't really that different from the first game, and you're right, but I'm not wrong. They're still as enjoyable as they were in the first game. Now, if you do have the argument that you're disappointed that there's not a new ranked mode, I kind of agree. It would have been nice, and hopefully we will get a ranked mode in the near future. Hopefully more than one, but only time will tell. There are other modes like Private Battle and League Battle and whatnot, and they all work fine, right? Whatever. However, there is one big new mode in Splatoon 2, and that's Salmon Run. This is basically Splatoon's version of a horde mode or like a zombie mode or whatnot, and it works really well. You and 3 other players team up with a set weapon cache and have to defeat salmon creatures called Salmonid and a variety of different Salmonid bosses. Your goal is to defeat bosses, collect golden eggs, and survive a certain number of rounds. Everything here works really well, with a variety of bosses and the occasional surprise to keep you on your toes. It feels really fresh, no pun intended, and really enjoyable. Honestly, I only have one problem with this mode, that being the time limit. You can only play Salmon Run on certain days and at certain times. Sometimes it can be in your favor, and other times not so much. I have heard they do plan on adjusting the time limit based on feedback, and it does seem that way, but as far as I'm concerned, it's still kind of a problem. I still have a blast playing these modes, however, and I think I find them more enjoyable than I did in the first game, so I'm giving it an amazing. As of writing this review, there are 8 stages in the standard game, 2 of which are remastered from the original. All these stages are fine, even if they do feel a bit smaller from the original game. This time around, stages rotate every 2 hours instead of the 3-hour wait in the original game. While I know people don't like the fact that you're locked down to 2 maps for every 2-hour period, I think that shortening the length from the original game goes a long way and has a greater variety. There is also the benefit of specific weapons being better on specific maps, so if you're locked down to those maps, you can always use those specific weapons. But if you don't like the system, I understand. There are also different maps in Salmon Run that alternate every once in a while. While you may say that's a small selection, I was honestly surprised there's more than one map. We do also know that future updates will be adding new maps, which is always welcome. With all this taken into account, I think I'm going to give stages a good. I've heard people call the Splatoon 2 single player a glorified tutorial, and I think that's selling it a little short. While yes, it does introduce you to a lot of the concepts and weapons that will appear in the multiplayer, that's not all it does. It also has its own mechanics that are specifically used in the single player. There's also a story that surrounds all the events, and while it is simple, it works for the most part. There are also 27 hidden collectibles throughout the game, which give you information about the world around you. One of the highlights of the single player is the bosses, which are really well done and creative for the most part. Without wanting to spoil anything, let's just say the final boss was not as great as the final boss of the original game. Even though I liked Splatoon 2 single player, it's not as great as the first games, so I'm just gonna give it a good. Let's talk about the waifus. First, we start off with waifus classic Callie and Marie. For the single player campaign, Callie is missing, so yeah. On the other hand, Marie is our guide throughout the campaign, and she does a pretty good job. Her character is still intact from the first game, while also throwing out quips and the occasional whatnot. She's honestly one of the highlights throughout the overall campaign. And then we have the new waifus, Pearl and Marina. In the original Splatoon, the dynamic was optimist versus pessimist, positive versus negative. And this dynamic is more along the lines of confident versus shy. People seem to be very against Pearl, and I was as well. But when you see her interactions with Marina, they actually work pretty well, and they play off of each other nicely. This is especially highlighted in the Splatfest announcements. I do want to point out that every time you turn on the game, you have to sit through their interactions, and I wish this game had learned from the original and added a skip button. It would have been nice, come on. Other than that, all the other characters in the game works fine, with the highlights being Sheldon, who gets some development during the single-player campaign, and Mr. Grizz, who has his moments during Salmon Run. Overall, I really enjoyed the characters, so I'm giving them a great. The first Splatoon looked really good. This game looks even better. The graphics have been overall touched up while keeping the game's semi-stylized style. This is most noticeable with how the ink looks, which has a lot of detail put into it. Even in the single-player campaign, the ink gets even more defined and gets this sparkle effect, which I don't personally care for, but I see why people would. While some people will argue that not enough of the graphics have been upgraded, I disagree. I think the style of the game keeps the 90s aesthetic intact while also allowing it to be cartoony and fun. Even in portable mode, the game looks good and didn't have any noticeable downgrades, or at least in my eyes. At the end of the day, the graphics look pleasing to the eye, so I'm giving them a good. I like the music overall throughout the game. However, I don't think it's as strong as it was in the first game. The tracks in the online matches don't stand out as much as they do in the first game. However, there are still good songs. I like the Splatfest music, I like the end credit theme, fresh start by the way. A lot of it works. It just doesn't reach the potential the first game delivered on. Overall, I say it's still very enjoyable, so I'm gonna give it a great. I'm torn on whether or not to subtract points from the final score because of how shitty this online service is. I'm not talking about the in-game online multiplayer. That works perfectly fine, and I have yet to have a problem with it. What I'm talking about is the Nintendo Switch online app for smartphones. The idea of going on your phone to check your rank, future stages, buy gear, and all that jazz is perfectly fine, and the first game did something very similar. The problem arises when you try to play with your friends and voice chat with your friends. Talk about a problem that was solved 10 years ago, but yet Nintendo will still find a way to make it difficult. Just setting up a lobby with your friends is so much more inconvenient than it should be. The fact that you have to keep the app open at all times is a tremendously stupid idea. The funny thing is, in theory, the app isn't the worst idea ever, as long as, of course, all the same features were available on the console. But nope, this is just another example of Nintendo not understanding how the modern world works. You know, I want to give this a really low score, but because everything else technically works, I'm just going to give it a bad. If it wasn't obvious, the one thing I want you to take away from this review is that Splatoon 2 is not a remake, not a remaster, not a 1.5 version. No, it's a fully fledged bona fide sequel. Does it change the core gameplay? Not really, but it still has changes and adds a lot of new things that does qualify it as a sequel. So what if it's similar? It's still more enjoyable than ever. I thought, especially as Nintendo fans, we all understood how this works.
We know that Nintendo keeps making the same games over and over again. We don't care. I mean, hell, if it was enjoyable the first time, why wouldn't it be enjoyable every time?
I mean, Pokemon has been the same game with minor changes for 7 generations now, and we never cared. The last 3 Kirby games have been exactly the same with just a new gimmick, and they keep getting better and better. And we even can look outside of Nintendo at series like Call of Duty, Dark Souls, and of course every sports game ever made. So what sets Splatoon apart from all these games? Why do people not care about repetition in all these other games, but do in Splatoon? My theory is Splatoon is too repetitive. Being an online-focused game where you play the same matches over and over again, when you're doing the same thing so often it eventually wears on you. And 2 years was not enough time for it to become refreshing again, unlike other franchises. Of course, this doesn't apply to other franchises, especially Call of Duty. Honestly, I just don't get why Splatoon is such an exception to a rule that is followed by every other Nintendo franchise. With all this being said, I'm going to give Splatoon 2 a great, with a recommendation as a must-own Switch game.